Steve Harvey had asked married couples hundreds of questions over the years. Some made people laugh, some embarrassed husbands, some made wives cover their faces, but this one was supposed to be easy. Steve stood beside the family podium, cards resting against his chest, and looked at the older couple standing together. 42 years? The audience applauded. The husband, 66-year-old Gus Tillman, smiled nervously. His wife Connie looked down at the podium. Steve shook his head. 42 years is a long time, man. More applause. Then Steve grinned. So I gotta ask you something. Gus nodded. Steve turned slightly toward him. What's the secret to staying married for 42 years? The audience expected a funny answer. Maybe patience. Maybe communication. Maybe yes, dear. Steve clearly expected one too. But Gus Tillman said nothing. His smile disappeared. He opened his mouth, stopped, looked at Connie, then looked away. Steve waited. 2 seconds. 3, 4, the audience started becoming uncomfortable. And before Gus could finally answer, Connie reached for the microphone clipped to her dress. She removed it, placed it carefully on the podium. Steve's eyes widened. Ma'am? Connie looked at nobody. She said only 2 words. Excuse me. Then she walked away, straight off the stage, past Steve, down the center aisle, and toward the studio doors. Mom? Her daughter's voice came from the family podium. Connie kept walking. The entire audience turned to watch. Nobody laughed. Nobody clapped. Gus stood frozen. The doors opened. Connie disappeared through them. Then they slowly closed behind her. Steve looked at the doors, then at Gus, then back at the doors. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. Finally, Steve stepped toward Gus. I asked you one question. Gus swallowed. Yes, sir. Steve lowered his cards. What just happened? Gus stared at the floor. And when he finally answered, his voice sounded nothing like the man who had been laughing only minutes earlier. You asked the only question I didn't have an answer for. The room went silent. Steve's expression changed completely, because this was no longer about a game. And to understand why Connie Tillman walked off that stage after one simple question, you have to understand what had been happening inside their marriage for the previous 2 years. Gus and Connie Tillman had been married for 42 years. They lived in Joplin, Missouri, 2 children, a paid-off house, the same church for decades, the same kitchen table, the same side of the bed. From the outside, they looked like the kind of couple younger people point to and say, that's what I want. And for most of their marriage, maybe it was. Gus had spent 34 years as a pipe fitter. Power plants, hospitals, industrial sites, long shifts, early mornings, hard work. He was the kind of man who showed love by fixing things. If the sink leaked, Gus repaired it. If Connie's car made a strange noise, Gus was under the hood before she finished describing it. If one of the kids needed help moving, Gus showed up before sunrise. He wasn't a man of long emotional speeches. But for most of their marriage, Connie understood his language. Then, Gus retired. At first, Connie thought retirement would finally give them what work had always taken away. Time. She imagined coffee together in the morning, weekend drives, maybe traveling, maybe finally seeing places they had talked about for years. There was one place Connie had wanted to see since she was a teenager. The ocean. She had never seen it, not once. Every few years she brought it up. Maybe this summer. Something always happened. A roof needed replacing. A transmission failed. One of the kids needed help. Work got busy. Life got in the way. Connie never complained much. There would always be another summer. At least that was what they told themselves. When Gus retired, she thought maybe someday had finally arrived. Instead, Gus moved into the garage, not literally, at least not at first. But little by little, that was where he spent his days. He reorganized tools, fixed things that weren't broken, started projects, abandoned projects, listened to the radio. Connie would stand in the doorway. Want to go get lunch? Maybe later. Want to drive somewhere Saturday? We'll see. Want to sit outside? In a minute. Later became tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. Eventually, Connie stopped asking. Their marriage didn't become loud. That was almost worse. There was no affair, no screaming, no broken dishes, no drinking problem, no dramatic betrayal, just distance. Two people living inside the same house, slowly becoming experts at not disturbing each other. Connie still cooked. Gus still repaired things. They still went to church, still attended birthdays, still signed cards together, but at night they often sat in different rooms. And sometimes Connie would look at the man she had spent 4 decades with and wonder when exactly she had become lonely beside him. She tried twice to talk about it. The first time she suggested counseling. Gus shook his head. We're fine. The second time she suggested they speak with their pastor. Gus gave the answer she would remember for years. We don't need to air our business. So Connie stopped asking. Then, 14 months before they appeared on television, she visited a lawyer. Alone, the lawyer asked what had happened. Had Gus cheated? No. Was he cruel? No. Did he frighten her? Never. Did he drink? Hardly. The lawyer looked confused. So what's the problem? Connie sat quietly. Then said, there's nothing to report. She paused. That's the problem. Divorce papers were prepared. But Connie never signed them. She put them inside a drawer at home beneath the good tablecloth. Eventually, she told Gus they were there. He listened, nodded, then went back to the garage. That hurt more than a fight would have. The papers stayed in the drawer, unsigned, month after month. Their children didn't know. Their daughter Nikki suspected something. Their son Brent didn't. Connie and Gus had quietly decided that when the time came, they would tell them together. Then the call came from Family Feud. Years earlier, when their marriage still felt easy, Gus and Connie had applied to be on the show. It had been Connie's idea. They used to watch Steve Harvey together. Gus would shout answers at the television. Connie would tell him every answer was terrible. They filled out the application at the kitchen table, then forgot about it. Years passed, and just when they were considering ending their marriage, the show called. Their daughter was thrilled. Their son rearranged work. The whole family celebrated. Suddenly Gus and Connie were trapped inside something neither wanted to ruin. One last family memory. One last trip. One last time standing together while the children still believed everything was okay. So they agreed. They would go. Smile. Play the game. Come home. Then deal with the papers. They never imagined Steve Harvey would ask the one question neither of them could survive pretending about. Back on stage, Connie was gone. Their children were stunned. Steve looked at Gus. You want to tell me what's going on? Gus took a long breath. His daughter Nikki looked at him. Dad? That broke something. Gus closed his eyes. There are papers at home. Nikki frowned. What papers? Gus looked toward the doors where Connie had disappeared. Divorce papers. The audience reacted quietly. Brent stared at his father. What? Gus nodded. 14 months. Nikki covered her mouth. Steve didn't interrupt. Gus continued. Your mother went to a lawyer. Brent looked toward the doors. And you knew? Yes, 14 months? Yes, why didn't you tell us? Gus looked ashamed. We thought we were giving you one more good day. Steve slowly shook his head. Sir. Gus looked at him. Steve pointed around the studio. This is the good day? A few nervous laughs came from the audience. Gus laughed once. It sounded broken. No, sir. Then Gus looked at Steve. You asked me the secret to 42 years. Steve nodded. And? Gus swallowed. She was. Steve's face softened. Your wife? Gus nodded. She was the secret. He looked toward the doors again. She did the work. Steve said nothing. Gus continued. I worked. I fixed things. I brought money home. I thought that was what a husband was supposed to do. He rubbed his hands together. And I think somewhere along the way I started believing that because I never left the marriage, I was still participating in it. The audience was completely silent. Then I retired. He gave a small laugh. And apparently I retired from everything. Nikki started crying. Gus looked at his daughter. Your mama asked me twice to go talk to somebody. He shook his head. I told her we didn't air things. Then he looked around at the cameras. Guess I picked a strange place to change my mind. Steve looked down for a second, then back up. Let me ask you something else. Gus nodded. Steve pointed toward the doors. Why are you still standing here? Gus looked confused. Steve stepped closer. Your wife just walked out that door. Gus said nothing. Steve continued. She has probably been waiting 2 years for you to notice she was walking away. That landed hard. Gus's face changed. Steve pointed toward the aisle. So why are you standing here talking to me? Gus looked at the doors, then at Steve. Steve moved aside. Go, Gus hesitated. Steve pointed again. Go get your wife. The audience began applauding. Gus stepped away from the podium, then stopped, looked back at his children. Nicky nodded through tears. Go, Dad. Gus walked. Down the same stage steps, through the same center aisle, toward the same doors. The audience watched him all the way. When he disappeared into the hallway, Steve returned to the family podium. Nobody knew what to say. Steve looked at Nicky. You knew? She wiped her eyes. I knew something was wrong. Brent looked at his sister. You knew? I suspected. For how long? A while. Brent looked stunned. Steve rested both hands on the podium. Then he said quietly, families are funny. Everyone looked at him. You can live in the same house and still not know what somebody is carrying. No joke followed, no punchline. The show stopped. For several minutes. Nobody knew what was happening behind those doors. No cameras followed, no microphone recorded it. And that was probably a good thing. Whatever Gus said to Connie in that hallway belonged to them. Minutes passed. Then the doors opened. The audience stood. Gus appeared first, Connie beside him. They were not holding hands. That mattered. This wasn't some magical television ending where 42 years of hurt disappeared during a commercial break, but they were walking together, side by side. Connie returned to the podium. Her microphone was still sitting where she had left it. She looked at it, then picked it up, clipped it back onto her dress. Steve watched her. You okay? Connie nodded. I'm embarrassed. Steve frowned. Why? I walked off your show. Steve shook his head. Ma'am, people have done worse on television. The audience laughed gently. Connie finally smiled. Steve leaned against the podium. You want to tell us why you walked? Connie looked at Gus, then at the audience. I decorate cakes. Steve blinked. Okay, that got another small laugh. Connie continued. I've worked at the same grocery bakery for almost 30 years. Anniversary cakes are my specialty. Steve smiled. 40 years, 50 years, 25 years. Connie nodded. I've written other couples' names in icing thousands of times. The audience quieted. I spend all day making marriage look beautiful. She looked at Gus. Then I go home. Gus lowered his eyes. And for the last 2 years I've felt like I live beside my husband instead of with him. Steve listened. Connie continued. I want to say something because television likes villains. She looked around. My husband is not a bad man. Gus looked up. He never hit me. He never cheated. He never humiliated me. He worked hard for this family for decades. She paused. But sometimes a person can be good and still stop showing up. Gus's eyes filled. That's what happened. Connie looked at Steve. When you asked him what the secret was, she took a breath. I watched his face. And I knew he had 2 choices. Tell a lie, or tell the truth. Steve nodded. And? I didn't want to hear either one in front of everybody. So I left. Then she looked at Gus. And he followed me. Gus stared back. Connie's voice softened. That was the first time in almost 2 years he followed me anywhere. The audience reacted. Steve rubbed his chin. What happened in the hallway? Connie smiled faintly. That part is ours. Steve nodded immediately. Fair enough. But I'll tell you this. She looked at Gus. He asked me a question. Steve looked between them. What question? Connie shook her head. I'm keeping that one. Steve smiled. Okay. But it was the first real question he had asked me in a long time. Gus wiped his face. Steve turned to him. You got anything you want to say? Gus nodded. I spent 42 years thinking the secret to marriage was keeping private things private. He looked at Connie. I think maybe the secret is knowing when silence stops protecting your marriage and starts killing it. The audience applauded. Connie looked down. Gus continued, I can fix a furnace. I can run pipe. I can rebuild half the house. He shook his head. But she asked me to sit in one room for an hour and talk, and I acted like that was harder than everything else. Steve stared at him. Gus gave a sad smile. Turns out it was. Steve nodded. Most important things are. Eventually the game resumed. Steve asked Connie whether she wanted to continue. She did. Maybe because the family needed something normal. Maybe because after finally saying the truth, answering survey questions felt easy. The Tillmans played differently after that. Lighter. The pretending was gone. Nikki and Connie dominated one round. Brent finally started laughing again. Gus even gave an answer so bad Steve simply stared at him for 5 seconds. Man. Gus smiled. I know. Steve shook his head. You almost lost your marriage today and now you trying to lose this game too? The whole family laughed. Even Connie. And something about that laugh changed the room. The Tillmans won. That sent them to fast money. Connie went first. She scored 106 points. A huge start. Then Gus came out. Steve told him he needed 94 points. Gus nodded. The clock began. He worked through the questions. Good answer. Good answer, another strong answer. Then came the last question. Name something people always say they're going to do someday. Gus didn't hesitate. See the ocean. Connie froze. Steve noticed immediately. He looked at her. Then at Gus. But time was still running. The answers were revealed. Gus needed 31 points. The board flipped. See the ocean. Number 1 answer. 38 points. The Tillmans had won $20,000. Confetti exploded. The family screamed. Nikki hugged her mother. Brent grabbed Gus. Steve was celebrating with them. But Connie wasn't looking at the scoreboard. She was looking at her husband. Both hands covered her mouth. Steve noticed. He pointed. Hold on, the celebration settled slightly. Steve looked at Connie. Why did that answer hit you like that? Connie shook her head. Gus smiled. Steve looked at him. You know something. Gus nodded. Steve folded his arms. Tell me. Gus looked at Connie. She's never seen the ocean. Steve's face changed. Never? Connie shook her head. Not once. Steve stared at Gus. 42 years? Gus nodded. She's wanted to go since before we got married. Steve looked offended on Connie's behalf. Man, what have you been doing? The audience laughed. Gus smiled painfully. Working, fixing things, waiting for the right time. He looked at Connie. And every year something else became more important. Steve nodded slowly. Until today. Gus looked at his wife. Until today. Steve held up the prize card, $20,000, then pointed at Gus. What are you doing with it? Gus didn't even look at the money. There's an appointment on our calendar Thursday. Connie went still. Steve noticed. What appointment? Gus answered quietly. The lawyer. The room fell silent again. Connie stared at him. Gus continued. I want to keep the appointment. Connie's face changed. The audience didn't know what he meant. Neither did Steve. Gus looked at his wife. But I want to change what happens after. He swallowed. I want us to go. To the appointment? Yes, Connie listened carefully. Together, he continued. If she still wants to sign those papers after we finally sit down and say everything, he nodded. I'll sign. Connie's eyes filled, but after the appointment, he smiled. I want to drive east. Steve already knew. So we're going to the ocean? Gus nodded. If she'll come. The audience erupted. Connie held up one hand. Everyone quieted. She looked at Gus for a long time. Then she said the appointment stays. Gus nodded. I know. We are going. Yes, you are going to sit in that chair. Yes, you are going to talk. Yes, no garage. No garage. No pretending everything is fine. No pretending. Connie stared at him, then finally smiled, and if you do all that, she paused. I'll see the ocean with you. Gus started crying. The audience rose. Steve pointed at Gus. You heard the woman. Gus laughed. Yes, sir. Steve turned toward Connie. And ma'am? Yes? Make him drive. Connie laughed. Oh, he's driving. Steve nodded. Good, then Connie added. And we are not stopping at every hardware store between Missouri and the Atlantic. The audience exploded. Gus looked offended. Steve slapped the podium. Now that sounds like 42 years of marriage. The game ended. But the simple question stayed with them. What's the secret to staying married 42 years? At the beginning of the show, Gus Tillman had no answer. By the end, maybe he finally did. It wasn't never fighting. It wasn't keeping everything private. It wasn't fixing every broken thing except the distance between two people. It was noticing when the person beside you had started walking away. And then following. Not to drag them back. Not to convince them they were wrong. Just to finally ask, what do you need from me? And stay quiet long enough to hear the answer. Gus and Connie did not leave that stage magically repaired. 42 years don't get fixed in 20 minutes. But something changed. For the first time in 2 years, they were moving in the same direction. And sometimes that is where saving something begins. Not with a grand speech. Not with a perfect answer. With one simple question. And the courage to follow the person who walks away.